AI should work for everyone, not just the tech savvy. But right now, parents are scared, students are being left behind, and explainability often comes last. Today, we break that down. Hi, I'm Kieran, an author and advisor in AI, automation, and digital transformation. I work with some of the world's largest companies to help leaders understand AI's impact on people, performance, and progress. My guest today is Professor David Brown, Director of Computing Informatics Research Centre and Head of Interactive Systems Research Group at Nottingham Trent University. David's groundbreaking work includes using AI to support students with learning, physical and sensory impairments, virtual reality and rehabilitation, and social robotics for learners with autism. He's one of the leading voices in AI and accessibility, and today we're diving into how AI can be used for good and what needs to change to make that happen. David, very nice to meet you, and thank you for coming on today.
And you, Kieran, thank you for inviting me today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Let's start simple. What is AI and why are so many people, especially parents, afraid of it today?
There are many definitions of AI, but the one we tend to use in computer science is it's a technology which enables computers, but it can be machines too, to simulate human intelligence processes, and specifically around learning, reasoning, problem solving, perception, decision making, and creativity. The second part of the question is, why are parents afraid? And I think it might be just the way that news and journalism reports AI. It's skewed, I think, towards some of the perhaps potential negative outcomes of using AI. In the news, it's like, will people's identities be stolen and reputations be damaged? Will it skew election results? And I just don't think that some of the positive aspects of AI and potential uses are reported as much as some of the negative aspects.
Yeah, I kind of see that all the time. A journalist friend of mine explained it. She said, Kieran, if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, all the horrible stories make it to the top of the pile.
Exactly. It's how the newspapers. But I see it reflected in the parents I meet. I am a governor at a special school, and they come in and they express real fear of AI. And they know I'm a researcher using a range of technologies, including AI, to support people with learning disabilities and autism. And they'll say, it all sounds great, but I'm afraid fundamentally of AI.
Gosh, we've done a wrong job or a wrong list of parents if we're doing that. You work at the intersection of AI and accessibility. What does AI for disabilities really mean in practice?
So for me, it means using AI ethically and for good. So for us, we're using AI to support students with intellectual disabilities and autism, but in a very much human-centric approach, putting those students and their parents and carers and teachers at the center of any development process, and making sure we're using it for the right reasons, and we're developing it with those people in mind, and providing training data from those people and evaluating it with those communities for their benefit.
So what are some examples of where AI has made a real and positive difference for students with learning and physical impairments?
So, Karen, we've met before and we've talked about this subject before. So I'm going to talk about my experience. So we've been using AI in various projects to understand students' emotional states to do with learning. So whether students are engaged, bored, or frustrated in learning, and then what you do with that information. So you can use camera data, and you can look at things like facial emotional expression, eye gaze, body posture, analyze speech, and put those all together with machine learning to understand these states. And then if a student is bored, why are they bored? Is it because they're bored, the level of challenge of the learning materials is too high? If so, we reduce the level of learning challenge. Or if they're bored because it's just too easy, we increase automatically the level of learning challenge. Really, what we're trying to do is keep students in a state of educational flow. And why is that important for the students I work with? It's because without engagement for those students, there will be no deep learning or meaningful outcome. So we're just trying to promote engagement and learning.
I adore that. And now when you're explaining it, and you and I have talked in the past and you
Yeah.
explained it, it all makes sense. But I think people don't necessarily understand how AI makes decisions, and therefore we almost need to, give a definition of explainable AI, explain how AI has been used for vulnerable communities so that it feels, important, not risky, helpful, not
Yeah.
harmful. Does that make sense?
It does. So the basic premise in many research teams, and I, want to reassure people, many research teams that I know working at universities and working with industry are really, they prioritize the use of explainable AI. So the basic premise, as many researchers have said, is that an algorithm doesn't have to make the same choice as we would make as humans, but a human should at least be able to understand the process by which the algorithm made that decision. So it has to be explainable, and the methods and processes that make the decisions that AI systems make should be understandable to humans. You've probably all heard about black box models or including neural networks, but these are really hard to understand by even the experts who create them. Hundreds of hidden layers for some of the very deep neural networks, transmitting millions of signals, and even then they make an inference or a decision, but it's hard to then work backwards to understand the processes by which those models make a decision. So, it's really, explainability is really important because it provides transparency and clarity about how decisions are made. And if you have that, you will build trust and protect rights, especially in the communities I work with of very vulnerable populations.
Well, how do we, I suppose there's a couple of things here that come to mind. When we were at a conference recently for the ETF, Education Training Foundation, even the teachers in the room were worried that AI would be used, to, and I'll use my words, not anybody's specific words, but I'm going to dump vulnerable students to the AI, where I might dump a student, to a classroom assistant, and they don't get the same educational opportunity. What you're describing there is actually AI is in support and augmenting the teacher and the student to identify a particular need, to most importantly address that need.
Yeah.
But they're scared. Again, they're scared. And there could be, what I call a digital divide. And students who, and this is for educators and for students who are already facing barriers to access, through a variety of maybe financial impairment reasons or whatever else. It feels like a daunting task.
I think the first thing that you said, if I understood you correctly, was, we're just going to use AI for students, vulnerable students, and it will, it's an easy thing to do, and it will take care of a problem or an issue. I don't actually think that is the case. I think there already is a digital divide for people who are marginalized, including people with disabilities and autism. In order to have equity of access, you need really good internet. I need devices for underserved communities. But we really need to prioritize that we put people with disabilities and autism at the center of any development process. So why is it, first of all, we're developing the AI application? For what reason? It must be to support their behavioral or educational needs, rather than some kind of other purpose. And then everything should be developed in an inclusive and human-centric way. So you must include them in the design process. And you probably all heard about bias and training data. So the training examples you give to an algorithm are really important. And quite often you might hear of, an algorithm for people with autism, but actually it's really being trained on a typically developing population. So all of our approaches, if we're developing an algorithm to understand, say, emotional dysregulation and people with autism, we train the algorithm on video samples of people with autism. When we label those data, we do so directed by specialists in autism. So everything really, what we try to do is to address potential bias and fairness. And also some of our algorithms are really trained on facial and emotional expression, but we never use the raw data. What we do is convert that into a point cloud, a facial mesh, and it's those facial meshes, which are just a series of 500 odd points, which but represent a whole range of facial emotional expression. It's that we train the algorithms with. So everything we do is to address bias, to be safe and privacy preserving. And really, that's how we address ethical development and inclusive development of algorithms. But if we don't use, quite often, I've worked in assistive technology projects. Quite often we use assistive technology and special education, but it's developed on specialist devices and they tend to be very expensive. And I'm all for assistive technology too. But I think a lot of the systems we develop for marginalized communities should be developed inclusively on mainstream devices and designed inclusively. And AI is an example of that. So a classic example at the moment in your area of speciality is generative AI. It has great potential to support students and adults with learning disabilities, making decisions in social care or about their health options as an adult in the community, because I think it's a scalable solution. You don't need huge amounts of hardware to make it work, and you can really engineer it to provide prompts and responses which are differentiated into a range of different modalities such as speech, text, pictures, which are accessible by a wide range of people with different types of impairments. Engagement is really important for the students I work with. Without engagement, there is no deep learning, and it's the single best predictor of deep learning. And we found that working in learning outcomes such as communication and sequencing skills for students with PMLD, profound and multiple learning disabilities, it's at least as effective as traditional classroom instruction. And why is that important? Because if you're working in a special school, you don't just need one approach, you need many approaches to engage your students. Many potential. I think the only drawback with robotics is the expense, really.
Yeah, well, hopefully technology gets cheaper all the time.
It just gets cheaper all the time, but I still think it's one of the barriers in terms of robots in education.
Yeah, I don't think people realize not just that in terms of disabilities, but I think people who have computer technology, cameras, internet access, whatever else, they kind of, in the nicest sense, isn't it wonderful we can take all of this for granted? But I worked for a social housing charity for numbers of years, support member volunteering. And, even without impairments, people haven't had the same opportunities as you or I. They didn't get the opportunity to learn to read or write. Maybe they've got, dependency issues. Maybe you've got actually affordability issues, or or a whole host of needs that denies access. And that is part of my worry going forward, is that I hear the phrases every day, AI is making intelligence free and whatever else. Well, it makes it free if you've got access to all of the tooling and all of the kits and all of the, so we live in interesting times. It's not that we should feel guilty about what we have, but it's about how do we actually do something to bridge that. What also you do VR in rehabilitation. How does that tie into AI, and how do those tools support people with intellectual disabilities?
So, Kieran, I think we've been using virtual reality in rehabilitation probably as long as I've been doing any kind of research. So the first project is around stroke rehabilitation. So it's really after stroke, people have to practice a high number of quite boring repetitions of, such as in upper limb rehabilitation, things like it's called supination, pronation, reach to grasp. So we gamified that process and put it in a virtual environment. And then we thought, well, if people are doing this at home independently without a therapist, they could be doing the exercise in a wrong way, performing what is known as compensatory movements, which can cause further damage. So we use AI and vision techniques to work out if they're doing the movement correctly, and if they're not, to give them guidance to do it correctly using AI.
It's interesting that I met
Yeah.
a German developer a little while
Yeah.
ago. He was doing the same thing. He is a physiotherapist. What he was discovering is that his patients would turn up to get the physio treatment. They would get mended, for want of a better phrase, given exercise to do at home, and then come back having done the exercise wrong and harmed themselves. Now, you would think that, that was a great source of income, but he was correctly and ethically positioned that said, no, I want to do something about this. So we put it on a mobile phone. So when you're doing your actual exercise, then there's a digital twin watching you and giving you feedback and telling you to do more different things. So if we leave with one last thing, what would you say, David, to education leaders, policy makers, parents or listeners who are on the fence about AI, who don't understand this area, don't understand accessibility, design, or anything else? What would you like to say to them? What would you like them to do?
Well, those people are usually older, Kieran, I would say. So young people,
young like us.
Those people like us are policymakers, academics, writers like yourself. Young people have already adopted, and not only they're pushing the envelope of AI. The only people who are going to be left behind are people like us if we don't adopt. But so we need to do so in an ethical and trustworthy way. So work, with your communities to make sure we develop trustworthy, unbiased approaches to AI. But the only people who are going to be left behind will be those policymakers if they don't get in there and think, how can we use AI ethically and for good? So I work in a university, and I think this is a tremendous opportunity to improve your offering to students and to make your processes, I don't mean getting rid of teachers, to augment their practice and some of the boring things like marking and assessment, to free up time for the really creative uses of teachers in higher education. And it will give you a commercial advantage too.
Not one, but many things. David, thank you. Luke,
Thank
if we summarize anything today, you reminded us AI isn't a tool, it's a responsibility. From explainable systems to inclusive robotics, I love your work. It's designed intentionally. I love the way you describe that, because there are fear amongst educators and parents as well about black box.
Those fears are well founded, and that's really the imperative about why we should then move forward with our campaign, which you're part of, Kieran, to develop inclusive, human-centric, and trustworthy, unbiased approaches to AI, and we must do it now.